Hypatia. You probably heard the name. It echoes through history, right? It's wrapped up in this really powerful, really tragic legend of a brilliant woman, a philosopher, a scientist, who was murdered for what she believed. But what if that story, the one we all kind of know, isn't the whole story? Not even close. Let's dig in and find out what's really behind the legend.
The legend of Hypatia it's one of history's greatest hits. It's got everything. But behind that myth, there was a real woman. And the story of her death is part of a real, complex historical moment. A truth that's way messier and honestly way more interesting than the simple story we've been told. So that's what we're here to do. Peel back those layers.
To really understand the legend, we have to start where the legend itself begins, with the brutal, shocking event that made her famous in the first place. We're talking about one of the most infamous murders in the ancient world.
Okay, so picture the scene. It's Alexandria, Egypt. This place is a buzzing, multicultural hub of the late Roman Empire. The year is 415 CE. It's March. And the city's most celebrated intellectual, a woman revered for her mind, is ambushed in the street. She's pulled from her chariot, dragged into a church, and she's brutally, horrifically killed by a mob. This single, terrible act is the seed from which a myth would grow for over 1,000 years.
And over time, that story has been told and retold and reshaped to fit all kinds of different agendas. You know, for some, she's a martyr for science, a hero of reason struck down by ignorance. For others, she's a feminist icon, a brilliant woman destroyed by a jealous patriarchy. And for others still, she's a kind of pagan saint, the last light of classical philosophy extinguished by a wave of religious fanaticism. But are any of these narratives really true? To find out, we have to look past the murder for a minute and actually meet the woman herself. Born around 350 CE, Hypatia wasn't just some philosopher scribbling in a dusty room somewhere. No way. She was the head of the extremely prestigious Neoplatonist school in Alexandria. In a city that was literally teeming with great minds, she was considered the leading intellectual of her time. She was a public figure, a star.
And what's really incredible is the scope of her influence. I mean, she taught high-level geometry, astronomy, and philosophy. Students traveled from all over the Roman Empire, Christians and pagans, just to study with her. And get this, she was considered even more brilliant than her own father, Theon, who was a famous mathematician himself. She commanded this universal respect for her mind. Now, this quote right here really shows you how complex her world was. This isn't from some fellow pagan philosopher who agreed with her on everything. No, this is from one of her most devoted students, a guy named Synesius, who later became a Christian bishop. He clearly saw no conflict between his faith and her teachings. This one fact alone starts to completely unravel that simple religion versus science story. So if she wasn't killed for her ideas or her teachings, then why was she killed? Well, the answer has everything to do with the explosive political powder keg that was 5th century Alexandria. Okay, and this is the absolute key to understanding the whole thing. The central conflict that was tearing Alexandria apart wasn't a war between pagan science and the Christian church. It was a brutal, bare-knuckled political turf war between the two most powerful men in the city, and both of them were Christians. So on one side you have Orestes. He's the Roman Prefect, the guy who represents the secular government authority. And on the other side, you have Cyril. He's the Patriarch of Alexandria, and he wields enormous religious power. These two were locked in a bitter struggle for total control of the city. And Hypatia? She wasn't some neutral observer on the sidelines. She was a close friend, a trusted ally, and a very influential advisor to Orestes. And for Cyril, that made her a major political threat.
See, Hypatia's lectures and her salon, they were a gathering place for the city's elite. It was a hub where political alliances were forged. Her wisdom wasn't just abstract, it was political. Cyril and his followers became convinced that she was the one whispering in Orestes' ear, stiffening his resolve and preventing him from caving to the Patriarch's authority. She was killed not for what she taught, but for who she advised. And the group that carried out the murder? This wasn't just a random, angry mob that got out of control. No, they were known as the Parabolani, a militia of about 500 men who were fiercely loyal to Cyril. They were, for all intents and purposes, his private army. This wasn't a riot. It was an organized, political assassination. So, if it was a political hit, how in the world did it get transformed into this timeless legend about the great war between science and faith?
All right, let's just tackle this myth head on. Was her identity as a pagan scientist the actual reason for her murder? Well, if you look at the historical sources from the time, the answer is a pretty clear no. I mean, listen to this guy. His name is Socrates Scholasticus, and he was a Christian historian writing not that long after it all went down. He doesn't blame her paganism. He doesn't blame her science. He says straight up that the murder was because of political jealousy and that it brought a deep shame and disgrace on the Church of Alexandria. Even contemporary Christians saw it for what it was.
So the conclusion from the primary sources is pretty undeniable. Her murder was a cold, brutal act of political calculation. She was seen as an obstacle to Cyril's quest for absolute power, and so she was eliminated.
It was actually centuries later that her story got picked up and totally repurposed. During the Enlightenment, writers like John Toland turned her into a symbol of pure pagan reason being crushed by religious barbarism. Then, fast forward to the Victorian era, and they romanticized her as this beautiful, tragic martyr. And then, of course, in 1980, Carl Sagan famously held her up in Cosmos as this icon for science, the last light snuffed out by the darkness of faith. Seems like every era just remade Hypatia to fit whatever battle they were fighting at the time.
So where does that leave us with the real story? Well, it leaves us with something that's far more complex, and frankly, a lot more human than the myth.
The real Hypatia was all of these things at once. She was an absolute genius, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher. She was also an influential political advisor, a major player in her city. She was a beloved mentor to people from all different backgrounds. And in the end, she was the victim of a savage power struggle that had almost nothing to do with her philosophy.
And that, right there, is the crucial takeaway. Her story isn't some simple fable of science versus religion or light versus darkness. It is a stark, brutal reminder that so much of history is driven by the messy, very human mechanics of power. The labels and ideologies might change, but the thirst for control, that's a tale as old as time.
Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Hypatia's real story is complicated, but for centuries we've insisted on turning it into a simple myth. So the real question isn't just who was Hypatia, it's why are we so determined to flatten the past into these neat little boxes of heroes and villains? Maybe the greatest tribute we can pay to a philosopher like her is not to turn her into a symbol, but to actually do the hard work of grappling with the complex, uncomfortable truth of her life and her death.